Welcome back to The Explainer. So, today we're diving into a really fascinating dynamic: how everyday people, like you and me, can deeply engage with complex, sacred texts without getting completely lost. I want you to imagine the Quran as this vast, incredibly beautiful landscape. Now, to navigate it safely and to really appreciate its depths, we need two things. First, a reliable map drawn by absolute experts. And second, a precise compass that we can actually hold in our own hands. Today, we're going to unpack exactly what that compass looks like and how you can use it. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll start with the Quran, the layperson, and scholars. Then we'll look at what ayat muhkamat actually are, followed by how to detect them. We'll do a quick case study on the interpretation of fasting. And finally, we'll wrap up with building a safe foundation for reasoning. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the Quran, the layperson, and scholars. You know, the source material kicks off with this incredibly empowering starting point. The Quran is open to absolutely everyone. Seriously, you don't have to be a lifelong theologian to seek understanding here. Whether you're a scientist looking through the lens of biology, maybe a mathematician analyzing complex patterns, or just an everyday layperson, which is often referred to as the Ummah, the text is right there for you. It's there to study, to understand, and to be inspired by. But okay, to explore safely, we really need some rules of the road. While personal inspiration is highly encouraged, we've got to have strict guardrails to prevent things from just turning into chaos. The source makes it crystal clear: lay people must not surpass the interpretative boundaries set by the ulama, the scholars. And why is that? Well, because overstepping those bounds usually leads to these out-of-context, overly liberal interpretations that honestly confuse rather than clarify. What we're aiming for is a beautiful synergy, where the Ummah and the ulama mutually inspire each other based on their own unique expertise. But we have to keep our self-awareness intact. Our limitations as everyday learners mean our insights, as valuable as they are, simply don't overrule centuries of established scholarly consensus.
Moving on to Section 2. What are ayat muhkamat?
So let's establish a mental anchor for the rest of this explainer. Ayat muhkamat refers to specific verses characterized by their absolute simplicity. I mean, they are straightforward, firm, and easily understood without any hidden meanings or ambiguity. When you read them, the core message just clicks immediately. This, right here, is your compass. And this framework isn't just some arbitrary thing scholars invented. It's directly rooted in the text of the Quran itself. Surah Ali Imran, verse 7 states, "In it are verses that are precise, the muhkamat. They are the foundation of the book, and others are unspecific, the mutashabihat." So the text actually acknowledges its own dual nature right there. You have the clear, foundational verses, and then the more complex, ambiguous ones.
All right, Section 3. How to detect ayat muhkamah.
So how do we actually find them? Well, the source material lays out this highly practical, three-step detection process that literally anyone can use. Step 1, just simply read the verse and form your basic understanding of it. Step 2, check the ulama's tafsir, which is the official scholarly interpretation of that exact verse. And step 3, look for a match. You're asking yourself, does my initial simple understanding actually align with the context and perspective provided by the scholars? And this perfectly illustrates the contrast. If your understanding and the scholar's interpretation align completely, like they are pointing in the exact same direction with the exact same context, boom, you have found an ayat muhkamat. It's a firm, clear verse. On the flip side, if you read a verse and the scholarly tafsir reveals a completely different meaning, taking you into diverging directions, metaphors, or deep theological ambiguities, well, you've encountered the mutashabihat. You've officially hit the complex terrain. But this naturally brings up a pretty crucial question, and it's one that happens all the time in real life. What if your initial interpretation matches the scholars perfectly, but as you dig into the specific practical details of the verse, things start to diverge?
That brings us perfectly to Section 4, Case Study, Interpretation of Fasting.
Let's break this concept down with a real-world example. Think about fasting. When we read verses about fasting, the core concept, that fasting is an act of worship where you reduce eating and drinking, is universally understood, right? Your understanding and the scholar's tafsir align perfectly. So that core concept is muhkamat. But what happens when we start asking how to fast? You know, the exact times, specific methods, the exceptions for things like travel or illness. That implementation part requires deep, nuanced scholarly debate, and it leads to divergent interpretations. Because of that, it falls squarely into the mutasabihat category. So the key takeaway here is recognizing exactly where that clear foundation ends and where the complex details begin. The Muhkamat gives us the what and the why, which are easy enough for us to grasp, but the complex how, that belongs to the scholars. Acknowledging this division really requires some humility. It requires us to be fully aware of our own limitations as laypeople, knowing when to step back, and comfortably handing the wheel over to the experts when the terrain gets a bit too tricky. Finally, let's head into Section 5, a safe foundation for reasoning.
Relying on the Muhkamat creates an incredibly secure landscape for our minds to reason within. First of all, its sheer simplicity means you just won't get lost in the theological weeds. Second, because these verses are foundational, they absolutely do not contradict other clear verses. When you stack them all together, they build this robust web of comparative knowledge. You really start to see the bigger picture. And honestly, most importantly, having this solid, unambiguous foundation allows you to safely navigate and resolve the larger mysteries and polemics that you're going to encounter in life, simply because your core understanding is firmly anchored.
Now, as empowering as all of this is, the source material leaves us with one final, absolutely essential safety check. Continuous learning is a loop, it's not a straight line. Even when you're dealing with verses that seem incredibly simple and firm, human language can be tricky, right? Meanings can sometimes overlap. So the absolute safest path to independent learning is one that consistently circles back to the ulama's teachings. You explore, you find those clear meanings, and then you verify with the experts. It just ensures you never drift out of bounds.
We have covered a lot of ground today, from understanding our own limitations to really utilizing these clear verses as our navigational compass. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. How will you use the simplicity of the Muhkamat to safely guide your own lifelong journey of understanding the Quran? Keep your compass calibrated, respect the mapmakers, and never stop learning. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.
Welcome, everyone. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating explainer on the epistemology of the Quran. Now, when a lot of folks think about religious texts, they kind of just picture this simple, straightforward list of do's and don'ts, right? Just a bunch of rules. But what we're going to look at today absolutely flips that idea on its head. We're going to see how the Quran constructs truth, not just as a rigid set of laws, but as this intricately woven, highly logical framework. I mean, it's literally a masterclass in internal consistency, and I am super excited to guide you through exactly how this works.
So, to make this rather heavy academic concept easy to digest, we've broken the explainer down into 5 main pillars today. We'll be looking at the mystery of opposing verses, the principle of internal consistency, implicit details in hadith, oceans of ink and logic, and finally, understanding logical consequences. It's all about cross-referencing, supplementary context, and human deduction. Let's get right into it.
All right, starting with part 1, the mystery of opposing verses and resolving ambiguity. One of the biggest myths out there when reading ancient, complex texts is this expectation that every single sentence is going to contain the absolute entirety of a ruling. That's just not how sophisticated literature operates, and it is definitely not how the Quran operates. Consider this brilliant Socratic hook we get right out of chapter 21, Al-Anbiya, verse 98. It basically says that you and whatever you worship besides God are fuel for hell. But hold on a second. Think about that. What about genuinely good, pious people? Like, say, certain prophets, who were turned into objects of worship by other people, completely against their own will. Does that mean those good people are going to hell just because someone else decided to worship them? No way, right? It creates this immediate cognitive dissonance, a real logical friction. So let's see how the text actually solves this dilemma. And this right here is exactly why we can't just read a single verse in a vacuum. On one hand, we've got that general rule from verse 98, false idols and their worshippers face punishment, but then look what happens next. Just 3 verses later, in Al-Anbiya 21:101, the text explicitly clarifies things. It says, "Indeed, those for whom the best reward has proceeded from us, they are from it far removed." Boom. This immediately resolves the ambiguity. The text clarifies itself, proving that good people who never asked to be worshipped are entirely excluded from that initial punishment. One verse sets the general law, and another provides that absolutely necessary specific exception. Moving on to part 2, the principle of internal consistency. Because as we just saw, a single verse doesn't hold every historical context or every tiny little detail. The reader, that's us, is actively required to find these causal connections across multiple chapters. Just look at this powerful quote from chapter 41, Fusilat, verse 42. It boldly claims that falsehood cannot approach the text from the front or the back. Now, this isn't just some poetic boast, right? It's a structural guarantee. It's the text setting a standard for itself, claiming perfect internal protection, and demanding that the reader look for that seamless consistency. Basically, if you think you found a contradiction, well, the text is telling you that you probably just haven't found the connecting verse yet.
So let's define our core term here based on what we've seen so far. The epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, of the Quran really relies on this internal sufficiency. It's this concept that the text fundamentally explains itself to maintain its own truth and solve its own apparent ambiguities. But it also acknowledges a supplementary role for the prophet, and crucially, it demands active logical reasoning from you, the reader.
Okay, part 3, implicit details and the role of hadith.
So, the crucial point is, what happens when specific granular details are not explicitly laid out in the main text? Well, let's look at the hierarchy of information here. Step 1. The Quran sets the fundamental, broad baseline. Think of the command to establish prayer, for example. But it doesn't hand you a step-by-step physical manual. That's where step 2 comes in. The hadith, these recorded sayings and actions of the prophet, step in to provide those highly specific operational details, like the exact physical rules of shalat. And step 3 is the critical boundary. These authorized supplements act strictly as a subset of the broader baseline. They give you the how-to, without ever adding to or subtracting from the core theological meaning established in the main text. It's honestly a perfectly nested system of knowledge.
Which brings us to part 4, oceans of ink and logic. Now, you might be wondering, why is this tiered system even necessary? Why not just write every single detail down into the primary text and call it a day? Well, we have to confront the sheer physical impossibility of documenting the infinite. Take a second and just absorb the magnitude of this quote from Al-Kahf, verse 109. If the ocean were ink for the words of my Lord, the ocean would be exhausted before the words of my Lord were exhausted. Wow. It is a strikingly beautiful poetic metaphor. But beyond the poetry, it's conveying a very deep epistemological reality. It's highlighting the stark contrast between the sheer, infinite volume of divine knowledge and the very finite reality of a physical, readable book. Because you literally cannot fit all the facts, all the historical nuances, and all the universal truths into one single finite volume, the reader's role changes. You aren't meant to just be a passive consumer of a list. You're meant to be an active participant. This metaphor directly leads us to the necessity of active human deduction. We literally have to use our minds to uncover the implicit teachings. And this brilliantly illustrates our final section, part 5, understanding logical consequences. The text actually formally teaches us how to use deductive reasoning. It models the exact logic it expects us to use. Let's trace this fantastic if-then logic map derived from Al-Anbiya 21:22. The text proposes a premise. Step 1, let's assume multiple gods exist, in the heavens and the earth. Okay, step 2, the logical consequence. If that were true, they would inevitably compete, and the heavens and earth would fall into absolute ruin and chaos. Then step 3, the empirical observation. Look around you. The universe operates in perfect, unified order. There's no chaotic destruction. So what's the inescapable deduced conclusion? There can only be one God. It takes this profound theological concept and transforms it into a highly digestible, modern deductive logic puzzle. The text also uses logical impossibilities to really cement absolute truths. Consider this highly poetic verse from Al-Araf 7:40 regarding those who arrogantly reject the truth. It says, "The gates of heaven will not be open for them, nor will they enter paradise until a camel enters into the eye of a needle." Now, what's really interesting here is how this metaphor functions mechanically. A giant camel passing through the microscopic eye of a sewing needle isn't just, a bit difficult. It is a physical, logical impossibility. By attaching the fate of the arrogant rejectors to an event that literally cannot happen, the text leaves zero room for misinterpretation. It uses a logical absolute to solidify an ultimate undeniable truth right in the reader's mind. It's basically the ultimate rhetorical mic drop. So we've journeyed through how this test utilizes internal consistency to solve apparent contradictions, We've seen how it establishes broad baselines and relies on supplementary context for the finer details. And we've uncovered how it actively demands deductive reasoning from us, its readers, using everything from logic puzzles to striking metaphors of infinite oceans and Meadle's eyes. It is a profoundly structured epistemological framework. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to ponder today. How can you take this rigorous method, cross-referencing, looking for internal consistency, and using active logical deduction, and apply it to better understand the complex information and texts you encounter in your own everyday life? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating logical architecture with me today. Keep questioning and keep analyzing. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into something incredibly fascinating, Al-Quran and reasoning. We're going to completely decode how this ancient text actually lays down a remarkably rigorous framework for absolute logic. We're stripping away the traditional lenses you might be used to, and instead we're tearing down the precise structural mechanics of its reasoning. We're talking analogies, variables, cross-scale logic, the whole shebang. So buckle up because this is absolutely going to shift how you look at language, metaphor, and literally logic itself. Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a massive, fundamental cognitive dilemma to deal with right off the bat. How exactly does our profoundly limited human brain digest a concept that is completely infinite? Think about it. We are beings totally bound by time, space, and our physical senses, right? So when an infinite, boundless message needs to be communicated to a finite, bounded mind, well, we hit a monumental bottleneck. How does that communication even happen?
Which perfectly sets up Section 1, Understanding the Infinite.
Now, before we get to the solution, we've got to clearly define the boundaries of the problem. On one side, we have an infinite God, the absolute, and on the exact opposite side, we've got the limited human mind, the relative. There is a literal, hard boundary here. According to the source text, our brains just naturally cannot digest anything that exists entirely outside of our sensory experience. It's kind of like trying to explain the color red to someone who has never had sight, or, explaining a four-dimensional shape to a three-dimensional being. The hardware simply isn't built to run the software. So to make the absolute understandable to the relative, the message literally has to be converted. And that brings us to Section 2, Analogy as a Logic Bridge. To cross this massive gap, the text uses a brilliant workaround, analogies. But not just as pretty poetic flair, we're talking about highly functional logic bridges. It takes the infinite and essentially translates it into a recognizable human language. The source material highlights this perfectly with a specific verse. Indeed, Allah is not timid to present an example, that of a mosquito or what is smaller than it. Now, the text explicitly points out that historically, and honestly even today, a lot of people hastily reject these concepts. They read about a mosquito and think, wait, what does a bug have to do with divine, absolute truth? But by reacting that way, they completely miss the underlying logical framework. They just don't see the bridge. And this brilliantly illustrates how the text intentionally uses super common, concrete sensory items to map out highly abstract truths. Just think about it for a second. A mosquito, a fly, a spider building a fragile web, the nature of light, or the way water flows. These are physical, tangible realities that someone living thousands of years ago, or a quantum physicist today, can easily observe and understand. By tethering an infinite abstract concept to a concrete variable like a spider, the text essentially builds a really sturdy bridge for our limited minds to walk across. All right, moving on to Section 3, Menalar Lintas Scala, or cross-scale reasoning. To really grasp cross-scale reasoning, we first need to define a core concept from the source material, modular reasoning. Think of this exactly like algebra. In modular reasoning, a word is basically treated as a variable. Just like an x or y in math, a word's value, whether that's a quantity or a quality, can totally change depending on the context. But the structural rule itself, that remains absolutely identical. To see how this builds, let's just consider basic physics for a second. We all know that velocity equals distance divided by time. The v, s, and t are just variables. The actual numbers you plug in can change constantly, but the formula itself is absolute law. Now, apply this exact same logic to linguistics. The text uses words as variables, functioning with changing quantities or qualities, operating totally inside rigid logical formulas. Let's dig deeper into this in Section 4, the modular variable concept. To really lock this in, we're going to look at what is probably the most mind-bending example from the source material. We're going to take a famous ancient metaphor and treat it exactly as the text intends, as a rigid, universal, modular formula. You've probably heard this phrase or some variation of it before,
And they will not enter paradise until a camel enters into the eye of a needle. For centuries, right, people have read this and just thought of it as colorful, poetic imagery, basically meant to say, hey, it's really hard. But the source material argues that this isn't just poetry at all. This is a mathematical statement of absolute truth, just waiting to be logically decoded.
Now, what's truly fascinating here is how we can break this exact metaphor down into modular steps. Let's decode it together. Step 1, the camel. In our logical formula, the camel simply represents the variable of large capacity. Step 2, the eye of a needle. This represents the variable of small capacity. Step 3, the interaction between these two variables yields a universal truth, and that truth is a large capacity is absolutely impossible to fit into a smaller capacity. The camel and the needle, they are just the sensory bridge. The underlying formula is what really matters.
And here is where we hit that concept of lintas scala, or cross-scale reasoning. That logical truth, that a massive capacity cannot be forced into a smaller one, is not just a rule for animals and sewing equipment. It applies to literally everything in the universe across all scales. It applies to macroeconomics and trade. It applies to the complex interactions of molecules in chemistry. It even applies all the way down to the atomic or quantum scale. The law is unbreakable no matter how far you zoom in or zoom out.
So, the crucial point is this. Once you understand the formula, you can literally plug in any variables you want, swap them out. For example, the sun cannot fit into the earth. Completely true. Or swap them again. 1 liter of liquid cannot fit into a container under 1 liter. Also completely true. You can endlessly swap these modular variables out, but because the underlying structural equation is absolute, the truth remains perfectly 100% intact. Which leads us to the final piece, Section 5, Dismantling Logical Fallacies. So, why does all this actually matter for us today? Well, understanding how this ancient framework operates isn't just some fun linguistic exercise. It is a highly practical tool for our modern lives. The source material suggests that if we are patient enough to deeply reflect on these modular reasoning rules, it fundamentally upgrades our mental software. It empowers us to quickly detect absurd arguments in our daily lives. But more importantly, it uncovers hidden, disguised logical traps, the kind of fallacies that we might not even realize we're falling for, because they're wrapped up in complex, confusing words. By breaking arguments down into variables and checking the underlying formula, you basically become immune to bad logic. Which leaves us with a critical thought to end on. Look closely at the arguments you construct, the media you consume, and the decisions you make every single day. Ask yourself, are we truly reasoning using universal cross-scale logic? Or are we just trapped in unseen logical fallacies, totally confusing the variables for the formula itself? Take a page from this ancient framework, start looking for the bridges, test the capacities, and don't let the noise of the variables distract you from the absolute truth of the equation. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking something absolutely fascinating, a highly structured 5-step logical toolkit designed to help you deeply understand abstract concepts. We're diving into an approach called From Al-Quran to Al-Quran. What this does is outline a method of reasoning built entirely from within a sacred text, basically allowing the text to explain itself. This is a huge deal because it fundamentally changes how we interact with divine literature. Instead of just memorizing a list of rules, we're actually mastering a dynamic, living method of learning.
Okay, think about this for a second. When we approach complex, divine texts, do we just accept the end result? Or are we being taught a method of reasoning? Too often people view ancient texts merely as a list of dogmatic conclusions to blindly follow. But what if the text itself is actually a manual on how to think critically and logically?
This quote right here is a total paradigm shift. It tells us that the text doesn't just hand you the answers, it gives you the formula. Learning these underlying principles creates this brilliant self-sustaining cycle where we use the source to understand the source itself. By extracting the logical framework embedded right there in the text, we upgrade ourselves from passive readers into active, rigorous thinkers. To unpack this masterclass in reasoning, we're going to build a house of understanding following 5 distinct steps. First, the from the Quran to the Quran mindset. Second, the main foundation, which are the Muhkamat verses. Third, building relevance and logic. Fourth, finding universal meaning across scales. And finally, the key to understanding, finding analogies.
Kicking things off with Step 1, From the Quran to the Quran, understanding through its own guidance. This sets the overarching mindset for the whole journey.
What's really great about this is that we're dealing with a finite, manageable system. It's a literal toolkit with 5 rules of application. Prepare Muhkamat verses, establish relevance, trace logical consequences, look across scales, and find an analogy. You don't have to be a lifelong scholar to use this. It's a reliable engine for absolutely anyone to unpack profound truths.
Moving right along to step 2, the main foundation. Muhkamat verses. This is all about building a strong, unshakable base. You know, if you try to build a house on shifting sand, it's going to collapse, right? Well, the exact same principle applies to understanding abstract ideas. You absolutely must start with solid ground. So, the crucial point here is that you always start by selecting the Muhkamat verses. These are the clear, unambiguous foundational statements that directly fit your specific theme. Your entire framework relies on this base. If you want to study a specific topic, your very first job is to collect the most direct, straightforward texts on that subject. If your starting point is vague, your ultimate conclusion is going to be a disaster.
Now that our foundation is firmly set, we hit step 3, building relevance and logic, where we really start gathering our perspectives.
Let's say we take fasting as an example theme. We're no longer just looking at isolated, clear statements. You gather all the Muhkamat verses about fasting, but then you take it a step further. You ask, if this verse is true, what is the logical consequence of it? Tracing that logic connects your topic to entirely different parts of the text. You find the relevance to other verses, which actively widens your perspective and helps you form a much broader, highly precise understanding of the whole picture.
Which brings us to step 4, universal meaning across scales. This is where things get incredibly profound as we search for universal meaning.
But hold on a second, because before we go exploring abstract universal truths that apply to all of human experience, we have to anchor ourselves to an absolute limit. And that limit is, do not violate your Muhkamat verses. Whatever brilliant understanding you reach, it must never contradict your foundational verses. Honestly, no matter how enlightened or spiritually deep a new interpretation feels, if it breaks the clear, unambiguous rules we established back in step 1, it is instantly invalid. Basically, your roof cannot be so heavy that it crushes your foundation.
And this leads us to a pretty powerful myth-busting moment. You often hear people say that a spiritual truth is simply ineffable or beyond words, but the source fiercely argues that this is frequently just an excuse. Look at the massive difference here. Side A says, do not express carelessly, which is totally valid. You're just guarding against public misunderstanding. But side B claims, this is ineffable. The text warns that pretending a concept is too magical for human language is usually just a tactic to mask an incomplete understanding.
I absolutely love how incredibly direct the text is here. It says, just express it as far as it can be converted from abstract to realistic, or simply say, I do not understand enough yet. It challenges us to admit our own limitations instead of hiding behind false mysticism. Think about it. If the divine text was given to humans to be understood, then logically, it must be understandable. If you can't explain it, you just don't understand it yet. There is so much intellectual honesty in just saying, hey, I don't have the vocabulary for this right now, instead of blaming the truth for being too mysterious.
Finally, we arrive at step 5, the key to understanding, which is finding analogies. This is how we convert the abstract right into the realistic. This is the ultimate tool for ordinary people to bring the highest, most complex ideas right down to earth. The entire goal of this reasoning framework is to arrive right here, finding the analogy or parable behind it. Finding that perfect analogy makes the abstract and ambiguous suddenly become clear, realistic, and highly relatable. If you can find just one rock-solid analogy that accurately represents the complex idea, while strictly making sure it doesn't violate those clear foundational verses, you win. You've successfully decoded the text. Analogies are quite literally the bridge between human limitation and universal truth.
So armed with this incredible 5-step logical toolkit, securing your clear foundation, tracing the logical consequences, ensuring you never violate the basics, and hunting for that perfect comparative parable. What abstract verse will you turn into a realistic analogy today? Thank you so much for exploring this brilliant framework with me. Take these tools, test your boundaries, and never stop seeking clarity.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most studied and revered texts in human history. We are breaking down a highly structured, remarkably safe methodology for navigating the Quran. You know, whether you're completely new to this text or you've been peeling back its layers for decades, establishing a solid, reliable framework for your learning journey is absolutely essential. It's really all about finding that perfect, delicate path between deep personal inspiration and rigorous historical accuracy. So it all starts with a pretty fundamental question, right? Can we actually study the Quran completely on our own? It's that classic push and pull between personal accessibility and traditional authority. Do you need to be a lifelong academic, or is the text open for independent discovery? Well, the source material gives us a profoundly nuanced answer. But to truly grasp it safely, we've got to master both the technical mechanics of reading the text and the internal mindset we bring to it. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today's exploration. First, establishing the foundation of understanding. Second, finding logic and connections between verses. Third, relying on the crucial role of scholars' guidance. And finally, avoiding transgression. Starting right off with Section 1, Foundation of Understanding, or building a strong base. The absolute crucial anchor here is this concept called Muhkamat. Basically, these are the crystal clear, unambiguous foundational verses of the text. Think of them as the ultimate constitution. They establish the definitive, unbreakable rules. The source explicitly emphasizes that whatever nuanced inspiration or independent interpretation you might draw from the more allegorical parts of the text, it must never, ever contradict these core Muhkamat verses. They're literally the gravity that keeps your entire theological understanding from just floating off into wild, ungrounded speculation. Without them, the whole structure just collapses. All right, with that anchor firmly set, we move right into Section 2, Logic and Connection of Verses, Connecting the Message. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact three-step methodology the source lays out to keep our logic totally sound. Step 1, like we just established, never contradict that clear Muhkamat foundation. Step 2, don't read verses in isolation. Always, always hunt for other relevant verses to get a panoramic view. The text is deeply interconnected, so a standalone reading usually misses the bigger picture. And step 3, deeply analyze the logical consequences of your interpretation. If reading a verse one way leads to a conclusion that breaks another rule, well, you know your logic has a flaw. Grasping that cause and effect dynamic, it is absolutely vital. You see, when you can successfully map out the logical consequences of a specific verse, finding analogies and connecting them to similar contexts becomes incredibly intuitive. And why does this matter for you? Because it actively prevents cherry picking. It literally makes sure that when you arrive at a conclusion, your reasoning is firmly rooted in the text's holistic ecosystem, rather than just some standalone quote pulled totally out of context. Which brings us to Section 3, the crucial role of scholars' guidance, keeping the learning on track. First off, we have to establish this beautifully welcoming premise from the source material. The Quran really is for anyone to study. There are absolutely zero gatekeepers here. You don't need decades of formal academic study just to open the book and begin. Whether you're a curious beginner or a brand new convert, you are actively invited to read, reflect, and draw profound personal inspiration. It's meant to be deeply engaging for everyone. Now, what's really interesting about this is how that incredible accessibility has to be carefully balanced. Imagine a super bright creative learner. Their mind is just buzzing with connections, finding entirely new ways to look at ancient phrasing. Yet, even the most enlightened student still needs the grounded oversight of an experienced mentor or an established scholar. Why? Because unchecked personal logic can easily veer off track. We are absolutely meant to be inspired, for sure, but we have to stay self-aware that our individual understanding is always going to be somewhat limited compared to centuries of established scholarship. Moving into our fourth and final section, do not transgress the limits, the importance of humility. The source material really doesn't shy away from warning us about a lack of humility. Take chapter 72, verse 4. It explicitly links being foolish or ignorant with speaking outrageous, overstepping words against the divine. The warning here is stark. When we pair just a little bit of knowledge with a whole lot of arrogance, we cross highly dangerous boundaries. Ignorance isn't just a lack of facts. It becomes a literal transgression when we confidently speak on matters we haven't actually mastered. We see this caution built out even further in chapter 52, which asks if people are simply being commanded by their own unchecked minds, leading them to transgress. It's a profound critique of overly liberal, completely unguided independent thought. Look, our personal intellect and logic are amazing tools, but they have to operate within firm, established boundaries. If we just let our minds dictate meaning without any tethered historical context, we aren't studying the text anymore, we're just projecting ourselves onto it. But, amidst all these heavy warnings, the text takes this beautifully empathetic turn. Mistakes in the learning process are pretty much inevitable. Chapter 39 offers this incredible reassurance, directly addressing those who have overstepped. It says, "Do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins."
It's such a comforting reminder. If your pursuit of knowledge is honest and you happen to stumble or misinterpret something, that genuine effort is met with boundless mercy, not immediate punishment. Receiving that mercy, though, requires a very specific posture. The very next verse tells us to return to your Lord and submit to him. Essentially, it's about dismantling our own ego. It's stripping away that arrogance that makes us think we know better than the text itself, and bringing ourselves back to a state of pure intellectual surrender. We have to be willing to just admit when our logic has failed and gracefully accept correction. So what does that surrender actually look like in action? Well, the following verse lays it out. And follow the best of what was revealed to you. True humility isn't just sitting around feeling lowly. It's an active, urgent commitment. It means dedicating yourself to studying and applying the guidance properly, utilizing the best available scholarship before our time runs out. It's a call to immediate, continuous, guided action.
Bringing this whole explainer together, here is the absolute core highlight of our analysis today. Navigating the Quran safely requires a really delicate balance. We absolutely must use clear, unambiguous verses as our foundation and connect them logically. We are highly encouraged to seek deep personal inspiration. But the vital key to unlocking true wisdom is realizing our own limits, drawing that inspiration with deep self-awareness, and constantly referring back to the Prophet and established scholars. It's the perfect marriage of rigorous intellect and profound humility.
I want to leave you with something to really chew on. Have we placed humility above our own logic when studying? It is so incredibly easy to just fall in love with our own intellect and our own clever interpretations, isn't it? But as we've discovered today, the safest, most profound understanding only happens when we intimately know our limits. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep reflecting and keep passionately learning.